Thank you, each of you, for all those statements to sort of get us thinking about this idea and get settling into this idea of life and lifetime. So hearing you speak and thinking about sort of how these concepts like lifetime, are necessarily ubiquitous to the human experience, whether or not they're being directly engaged with across different types of research. Wondering what your thoughts are on what kinds of questions can we answer with data that comes on lives and lifetimes?
Way back in the 60s, Robert Merton, a sociologist, coined the term the Matthew effect. If you come from a Christian background, it refers back to some Bible verse about basically in biblical language, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. That concept has been explored a lot recently in sociology because it really does look at time as a key variable. Watching income inequality increase, for example, you're looking at societal level that's happening, but also at the individual level. And certainly in our longitudinal research, we've done studies where we look at what we economists call scarring, which is, does early unemployment have a negative effect on your income and other career opportunities later? And it does. But interestingly enough, I said before, Nancy has seen opportunities in our data. We started asking questions about depression and self-esteem decades ago. She started looking with me at trajectories of depression and self-esteem and how that changes and how early life experiences shape subsequent experiences, and sometimes things get worse and sometimes they don't. So they can kind of look at the Matthew effect from a psychological perspective as well. So it's one place where time as a key variable really does answer some key questions about the life course.
To think about experience for a bit, I have to answer a little bit differently, obviously, because I don't always talk in data terms. Mm-hmm. But I do talk conceptually about experience. So one of the things that often happens, and you know this if you teach also, is that our students, for example, assume that experience creates a subject and that it's unproblematic, that it's just simply that you are the sum total of your experiences. But that's actually not it's not an eternal idea. The idea that experience makes a subject really comes from the Romantic period. And so it's about 100 years old, that idea. So Joan Scott, who's one of my favorite philosophers on this topic, has had excellent ideas about this. And she says, we need to think of experience as something that in itself needs to be critiqued or thought or reflected upon. Under what circumstances are subjects allowed to have experience? Mm-hmm. What experiences are allowable inside of certain paradigms? And when Harvey was speaking, I was thinking about that. Kind of issue. What counts, and how can you open up your own practice so that you can see the totality of an experience? And to me, that actually makes experience more interesting as a category.
I think the fundamental one, and Harvey, I think, started off with this, is inequality, which feeds into another question that you have about the use of power over time. Equalities, that is no difference, and inequalities, essentially, you're really trying to get an image of society as consisting of different groups of people. You know, in Western models, there's a tendency to try to argue that we have a fair and just society, and therefore we are interested in issues of inequality. And yet, when you look at what happens to an individual over their lifetime, or when you look at time itself as a dimension, so what's happened between 1950 and 2018, you're talking about various stages on some kind of relational scale of inequality or equality. That to me would be really the main thing that it permeates other issues that we study, but I think that's the important dimension.
So shifting a little bit, the questions we can answer, we've also talked about each of you do, very distinct research in your own way with these sort of overlapping themes. So what questions do you especially want to answer and why?
In my own work, it's not going to look like theirs, right? And that's good, actually. Life is two things to me. One is that there's life that's the process of unfolding and experiencing, right? Which is very much the Heideggerian understanding of life as a process. But there's also life as a product. And that's what happens when those of us who study biography are interested in how lives get packaged and sold and circulated. And those textual lives can sometimes take over those other lives that are in process. And so I think that there has not been enough attention paid to the fact that those two things are in dynamic tension. And so for me, that's, I don't need to answer around time, I think, because I need that, I think these folks should talk. But I would say that to me, that tension is one that we need to think a lot more about, particularly those of us who are interested in digital lives, and also the way that mass culture talks and presents lives as something to be traded around, talked about, and also the way human rights constructs lives, that we, for the purposes of resolving injustice, to what uses are those lives put, and how do they relate to people's lived experiences? So that to me is the opening that I have there.
Well, yeah, I keep referring back to my own lifetime as a researcher and the study that has filled my spare moments for so long. But when we started, we really were concerned, as were many others, about, is this a lost generation? Devised a study that would track individuals in that group, and have done so for decades now. What I really wish we could do would be to start another study, or have done one 20 years earlier, to really see if that generation, and I'll be happy to talk about what I think generations mean, is that different from the current millennials or so on, because we love to sort of, as sociologists, psychologists, as public commentators say, well, they're so different, it's so different. I think I am quite different than my parents, but whether our colleague Matt Johnson is that different from Nancy and I is a question that I can't answer, because the way I do the research, I'd have to start another study and track those people for 30 years.
So I would like to actually become immortal so that I could actually do the ideal study that sadly is really lacking in the field of immigrant integration, and I think can create some confounding about generational differences and comparing generations which represent different experiences in different times. The current way that most people will discuss, I'm quite interested in the children of migrants, what happens to them. I do see that either narrowing of inequality or expansion of inequality as being a very important commentary on a society's ability to give people access to resources, to give them, as Max Weber would say, life chances. The current way of saying, if the first generation is not doing so well, will the next generation do better? And will they gradually get to be more similar to a large group of people in Canada, some 60%, who have been here for 3 or more generations, and some groups have actually been here since 1656. Most people actually do what we would call cross-sectional comparisons, which are hideously flawed, and there was an example of this in a newspaper article that was published about 3 days ago in the Toronto Star. They will go and they'll say, okay, the first generation immigrants who came over in adulthood have this income. And the next generation who was born in Canada have this income. And the third plus generation have that income. The article in the Star went even further. It divided all these generational groups up by visible minority status. The point that was being made was that the second generation, incidentally, tends to do fairly well. We can argue about this, but the point that was being made was that for visible minority groups, they're going downhill by the third generation, right? It's a U-shaped curve. Their parents don't do well. The second generation does better, but they hit rock bottom in the third plus generation. But you're not measuring descent. Any anthropologist will tell you generations mean lineal descent, that it's my mother, it's me, it's my daughter, right? And what you're doing is you're comparing the foreign-born in 2016 to the second generation in 2016 to the third-plus generation. You end up making, as the author of this piece in The Star did, he got his 10 minutes, well, not 10 minutes, who was it that coined Warhol, who said everybody has their 14 seconds or 14 minutes of 15 minutes. He's dead, actually. The questions, which really do have to do with changes across generations that signify whether we are in a society that basically gives people opportunities, or are we in a society where we've got structural barriers that by virtue of race or color or anything you want to think of, don't allow people to operate at their maximum capacity. I think those questions are valid. I think the way that we're packaging them are very, very suspect, because they're not studying generations based on descent. They're studying birthplace at one particular point in time.
One thing that I'm hearing, I think it's threads that have come up through all the comments we've had so far, is this sort of this broader context in which individual lives are playing out. We can, or maybe we must, broaden our focus beyond these individual lives to consider how the individual lifetime shapes and is shaped by this sort of broader socio-historical context that it happens in and the changes that happen therein. So in your work, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about how you think about this relationship between the individual lifetime and its context.
I have been in the past written about Wilhelm Dilthey, right, one of the founders of what is now understood to be sociology. One of the things that he was interested in was the idea of the life course, or the life stream, he called it. In German, I know it can be either. So it's the life stream. And this is actually the idea of liberal universality, that in somebody's individual life, you can see a microcosm of an entire generation. In that loose sense, not in the descent. I totally get your point on descent. He was the person who really said, history is the record of individual lives. That's what he's famous for saying. And his work gave impetus to doing biographical research in sociology in the 19th century. Research that subsequently, I think, people moved away from some of those ideas, but they stay residually in humanism. And so to me, understanding some of what that means. What does it mean to say that a subject is representative? And what is that representation actually about? I think needs critique. And that's partly because what Dilthey did not intend his work to be used to say this person or this ideal type stands in for all people. He actually thought the entire life course was what you had to think about. Unfortunately, I think people after him did think that we could speak synecdochically about people. And that has caused all sorts of difficulties with thinking about what I know in sociology used to be called deviance, but now those terms don't happen the same way that they did, for good reason. Just to end that, I would say that one of the interests I have in queer time is because time doesn't happen the same way for all groups. And the way you mark history or understand what your life course is about is going to differ between groups. And I believe that concepts like that can rethink our way of understanding even things like space, where I think we've been much better at thinking about how spaces are managed or understood differently by different groups. Cree people understand their life on Earth to be 7-generational, and that they might be at the 7th fire, which might be the time when they have to alter events in the world and Canada. That's a very different way to understand time than from the way I understand it. And so I think that's what I think we have to be alive to now when we start thinking through time conceptually.
Obviously, context matters a great deal. And in the field of demography, but also the more quantitative approaches in sociology, certainly from the 1980s onward, has been the classic mantra of age, period, and cohort effects. I think they encapsulate or they become labels for some of the complexities that you're trying to get at with your question. Harvey's been talking about changes over the life course, the whole process of aging, for example, is an example of the impact of the age of the individual, that what the individual experiences is going to be different at the age of 17 and the age of 70, and there are going to be all sorts of stages in between. You also have a cohort. A cohort is simply defined as a group that experiences the same event almost at the same time. It's bounded by time, so it could be within a year. We have what are called marriage cohorts, people who get married in 2018. We will have, the graduating class of 2018. Those are graduation courses, cohorts versus marriage cohorts. But that's another way about thinking of the context, that it's not just you experiencing changes across your own life cycle, but that there's a commonality with other people. And it's the cohort concept that leads us, I think, to terms like Gen X, Gen Y, the millennials, and so on. That's really what we're saying. It's just that we've got more popular labels to try to depict that. And then we have what are called the period effects, which are absolutely these macro cycles of change in which the cohorts and individuals as they age march through. And the major, we can talk about, we also have structural conditions that influence what goes on, but it's the period effects, like people who were born in 1920 essentially went through their teenage years in the Depression years. So the Depression, the housing crisis in the United States in particular in 2007 to 2009 is a period effect. The coming collapse of the US economy, here we go back again, is another period effect, right? And I think those are very useful because they kind of allow us to think about different kinds of contexts that impact on individuals.
I like to go back to Karl Mannheim, who back in 1929-ish, I think, wrote about generations, and he used the language a little bit differently, but talked about when you've got a set of adjacent birth cohorts, like people born in 1914, 15, 16, 17, who during their formative years, when their children or adolescents encounter some really significant societal or economic events. And I think he used the term dynamic destabilization. That's a terrible translation from the German. But if they, in fact, come to have an identity that's based on that these adjacent birth cohorts see and think that they are different, then we can finally call them a generation. And I kind of like that because it does fit with the example, of people growing up during where their parents lost all the money in the stock market, or Glenn Elder, who's one of the sort of grandfathers of life course research, his classic book, Children of the Depression, and just how different those people were because of those life-changing events. I find that a very useful concept, but it really makes me very skeptical of people talking about the millennials are different. That's where I keep coming back to that. But it does make me think about some of your research, Monica, because when you're talking about different generations of immigrants, they really are going through some of that dynamic destabilization or whatever when they come over to this country. Perhaps that Mannheim's term works well for the way you think of generations of immigrants.
And this is something that's come up a little bit, I think, so far, but maybe we can address it directly. Thinking about your own life stories and your lifetime work as researchers, how have your understandings of lives and lifetimes developed over time?
I've said that a little bit. I started by talking about how I began my research career, but in a very static sense. Like unemployment has problems. It does things to people, and slowly began to learn over time and realizing that things change and encountering other people who think differently. I just think of it as a much more, time matters, whereas at that time it was just, variables in an equation. So.
One of the things is that, when we live our lives, so many things happen. We'll say one thing, which is that I think when we think about narrative, okay, and that can be spoken or written, it doesn't matter. Narrative just means events that follow in order. But in fact, I think I've changed my ideas about that. as I've gone along, because I now think that some of my colleagues think that narrative, that we're born that way, that we have stories inside us and that that's how we understand ourselves. I actually don't think that anymore. I think that we actually learn how to do that. One of the reasons why is because some of you know this, so I'm just going to say it. Some of you don't know me, so it's okay. I used to be a minister's wife, and I was not an out lesbian. And so I was taught to do confession as part of what I did, and I was taught to do testimony as part of what I did. What the testimony does is it links earlier events in terms of your new thing that happened to you. What I realized was that my own journey in terms of my own identity, and I am a first-generation immigrant, and I'm from Gen X, apparently, but whenever I hear people talk about me, I'm like, I don't even recognize myself, so I'm glad you're talking about it. You learn how to do retrospective work to your story, but I don't think that we experience our stories that way as we're going through them. And I think they're often chaotic. And I think that's one reason why Facebook or something like that works the way it does, which is non-narrative. And why it insists on making narratives. Tell us your story. It tells us over and over again to recount our memories and do this. When in fact, that's not how we experience our lives very often. And so to me, I think as I've gone along, I've become less enamored of the idea that stories exist in us, but I think the ability to make sense exists in us and is something that we all want to do. And it's my own journey that's shown me some of those things.
I couldn't resist pulling up a quotation that I like very much from a novelist by the name of William Maxwell in his book, So Long, See You Tomorrow. Let me quote, "What we refer to as memory is really a form of storytelling that goes on continually in the mind and often changes with the telling. Too many conflicting emotional experiences are involved for life ever to be wholly acceptable, and possibly it is the work of the storyteller to rearrange things so they correspond to this end." And it,
Very nice.
isn't that nice? Yeah.
Yeah, I like that.
Just to, again, tweak this in a somewhat different direction. I think now we're talking a little bit more about our own histories, but certainly in the work that I've done, which can't be separated from my own experiences across time, what I now know and am really constantly amazed by is what the political scientists call path dependency. Path dependency isn't a prediction, but it is saying that if you go one branch in the road, you will encounter a different range of options than if you went to the other branch in the road. Path dependency is not necessarily always cumulative. I usually give a great deal of advice to my students when they're trying to figure out how to make their way in the world, which is that, well, you can make this decision. You can accept an offer at this university, and if you don't like it, get out of there within the year. You can reverse it, but you can't reverse it once you get to be a senior assistant because you're too near tenure, right? Path dependency often is cumulative. I don't think we study path dependencies of individuals very much in the field of sociology, and I would just simply say that certainly my own experience moving through time has I just marvel at the forks in the road that I took and the way that I ended up, which is quite different, not necessarily better or worse, but quite different than what I would have said, at 26 with a PhD. And
thank you to the panelists.
Absolutely.